In 1981, ornithologist Liu Yinzing had spent 3 years searching for the crested ibis across China. 14 provinces, 50,000 kilometers, and nothing. Before signing off on a paper declaring the species extinct, he asked for one last field trip. On May 23, 1981, in the Yaojigu Valley, he found 7 birds, 2 adult pairs and 3 chicks, the last representatives of the species on the planet. At the same time, on the Japanese island of Sado, a single living Japanese specimen sat in a cage at the conservation center, a female named Kin. Every attempt at breeding had failed. The Japanese population was functionally dead. 7 birds in China were the species' last chance. But the real problem was convincing people to live alongside it again. The Japanese crested ibis, the toki in Japanese, had walked the rice paddies of Japan, China, Korea, and Eastern Russia for 1,000 years. It was medium-sized, with a curved bill and a red mask around the eyes. It fed on frogs, insects, and freshwater crayfish in flooded fields. Its disappearance was not a catastrophe, it was a schedule. By 1934, the birds were being shot across Japan for collections and for feathers. Legal protection came too late. After the Second World War, post-war Japan switched to pesticides, and insects, frogs, and freshwater crayfish vanished. The toki fed on exactly these. Then wetlands were drained and streams were encased in concrete, and the bird had neither food nor nesting sites left. None of these decisions were made against the toki. That is precisely why they were so difficult to stop. On Sado Island, the birds held on longer, thanks to the island's isolation and traditional farming practices that had not yet fully converted to chemicals. But by 1981, only 5 remained. They were caught and placed in the conservation center. Breeding attempts failed. The birds were old and genetically isolated. They died one by one. One remained. Kin, a female, born in 1967. On June 29, 1981, while Kin sat in her cage on Sado, the Xinhua news agency transmitted a report. 7 wild toki had been found in the mountains of Shanxi. At the conservation center on Sado, staff heard it on the radio. Liu Yinzing, an ornithologist at the Institute of Zoology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, had spent 3 years combing China for a bird considered extinct since the 1960s. At that point, he was already preparing a publication concluding that the species was gone, but he had requested one last trip to Yang County. On May 23rd and May 30th, 1981, he found 7 birds in the Yaojigu Valley, 2 adult pairs and 3 chicks. They were perched in trees above the fields and did not know they were the last. Liu immediately published a paper in Current Zoology under the title Recovery of the Japanese Crested Ibis in the Qinling Mountains. Chinese authorities that same month halted mining operations in the area, banned pesticides on neighboring fields, and began restoring wetlands. The Japanese-Chinese scientific cooperation that followed was remarkable simply for having happened at all, given the complexity of relations between the two countries at the time. In 1985, a Chinese male named Hua Hua was brought to Sado to attempt breeding with Kin. The attempt failed. In January 1999, a new pair arrived at the center from China, a male named Yu Yu and a female named Yang Yang, a gift from the Chinese government. On May 21, 1999, the first chick hatched from the Chinese pair. The news was broadcast live on every Japanese television channel. The process had begun. Liu Yinzing followed it from Beijing, and at 87 he commented on each new release as a new stage. On October 10, 2003, Kin died in her cage at the conservation center on Sado. She was 36, a longevity record for the species. Her keeper told journalists, "I knew this day would come. She was very old and frail, but it was still very sad." Kin's death made front pages across Japan. The Japanese wild toki was extinct, but by that point the center already housed 39 birds, descendants of the Chinese pair. The breeding program that had failed for years was now producing results. By 2008, the total number of toki in captivity on Sado had exceeded 112 individuals. The problem lay elsewhere. Birds can be raised in cages indefinitely, but cages are not fields. These birds had never learned to find food on their own. They did not know the island, and the island, for its part, was still being treated with pesticides. The fields where Toki had once walked were still empty. No frogs, no crayfish, no larvae. Releasing the birds into the same environment that had killed their species would have meant simply a slow death in open sky instead of a cage. Someone had to change the fields. In 2008, simultaneously with the first release, the Sado Agricultural Cooperative launched a program called Toki to Kurasu Sato, the land where Toki live. Not a law, a quality certification for rice. Rice grown under this certification sold for more. 1,500 yen per 5 kilograms for the semi-chemical tier and 4,000 yen for fully organic compared to standard prices. Farmers who made the transition received a government subsidy of 27,000 yen per 1,000 square meters to offset yield losses during the transition period. The certification requirements were specific: reduce pesticide and fertilizer use by at least 50%, apply no herbicides on the boundaries between fields, conduct biodiversity surveys of one's own plots twice a year, and introduce at least one of 4 methods to restore the food chain. Deep puddles along field edges where small aquatic animals live through summer. Channels through which fish can move between fields. Winter flooding to preserve soil invertebrates. Keeping fields filled with water during the rice drying period instead of draining them completely. The system was engineered so that the ibis-friendly approach would bring more money, not merely more virtue. But between the decision to release the birds and the first wild brood lay 4 years of difficulties that are rarely discussed. Birds raised in cages could do almost nothing. The head of the Conservation Center, Masaru Hasegawa, told journalists in 2007 that our birds could not do anything. They did not know how to search for food in a field. They did not recognize natural predators. The first birds released stayed near the cages for weeks, flying no great distances and not exploring the island. To address this, the center built transitional aviaries, large enclosures that replicated a natural environment with trees, water, and field sections. Birds were kept there for months before release, learning to behave as wild animals. This slowed the program, but improved survival rates. There was another problem, invisible but more serious. The entire Japanese population descended from only 5 founders obtained from China. 5 birds is a genetic bottleneck. Research from Niigata University showed that the inbreeding coefficient in the population had risen from 2.2% in 2004 to 8.9% in 2018. Low genetic diversity made the birds vulnerable to disease and reduced reproductive success. This is precisely why Japan regularly asks China for new birds, not simply for numbers, but for genes. On September 25, 2008, 27 years after the last wild Toki had flown over Sado, the cages were opened. 10 captive-bred birds were released into the mountainous Kasado district. They flew, but flying was not the same as surviving. Some birds returned to the cages. Others died from collisions with power lines, infrastructure they had never encountered in captivity. Others could not find enough food even on the certified fields because they did not know where to look or how. For the first 6 years after 2008, natural reproduction was not sufficient for the population to sustain itself without new releases from the center. The birds born and raised in cages were slowly learning the island, and then, in the spring of 2012, 4 times faster than the models had predicted, a pair of released Toki built a nest in a wild tree on Sado. In April 2012, 3 chicks hatched. For the first time since 1976, Toki had been born in the wild in Japan. The parents had found crayfish and frogs in fields where farmers had cut back on chemicals in exchange for a certification that gave them a better price for their rice. One farmer, Takano Takaji, had carried those crayfish by hand. The market did the same thing automatically. Over the 14 years following the first release, from 2008 to 2022, the center released 446 birds into the wild. Some reproduced in the wild. The total population on Sado reached approximately 500 individuals. Japan reclassified the species from extinct in the wild to critically endangered. The difference between those 2 designations is 500 birds in the sky. The fields changed alongside the birds. By 2016, a quarter of all the island's rice paddies, 1,600 hectares, had adopted the certification, operating with half the normal chemical load or none at all. In 2011, the Food and Agriculture Organization added Sado to its list of globally important agricultural heritage systems. The phrasing of the reason was unusual. The island had restored traditional agriculture through its effort to save a bird. Then came the tourists. By 2021, 53,000 visitors per year, the majority arriving for the Toki. The economic impact of ibis tourism is 4.45 billion yen annually. The island that lost the toki to pesticides now earns its living by reducing them. But there is something that people on Sado speak of quietly. The wild population is growing. Yet it remains dependent on regular releases from the center. Hisashi Nagata said it plainly. In the first 6 years after 2008, natural reproduction was not enough for the population to sustain itself. The situation has changed, but the Ministry of the Environment still allocates more than 100 million yen per year to maintain the program alone. The birds in the sky above Sado are real, but behind them stands a permanent budget. Behind that budget stands another problem that scientists discuss openly. The entire Japanese population, 500 birds in the sky and several hundred more in cages, descends from 5 founders, 5 birds. The genetic diversity of the population remains critically low. That means any new disease, any pathogen to which these birds have no immunity, could destroy everything built over 25 years in a matter of weeks. This is why every new bird from China is not merely a number, it is new genes. And one more thing. The head of the Conservation Center, Yoichi Hokari, admitted to Xinhua journalists in 2022 that Yu and Yang, the pair that gave rise to the entire Japanese population, are still alive in the deepest cages of the center. Almost nobody sees them. The 2 birds that saved the species are living out their days behind camera monitors. Their descendants are not. On May 31st, 2026, 45 years after Liu Yinzing wrote 7 birds in a notebook on a tree, toki flew over the main island of Honshu for the first time in 56 years. The city of Hakui, the Noto region, the very place where the last wild toki on Honshu had been captured in 1970. 8 birds from Sado emerged from wooden cages as Crown Prince Akishino and Princess Kiko cut the ribbon. The crowd cried out. Among the spectators stood Muramoto Yoshio. He is 101 years old. For more than 70 years, he has been involved in toki conservation, since the time when the birds could still be seen on Honshu. He watched them take flight and said only one sentence: "I hope they settle in Noto." But Noto is not Sado. On Sado, it took 25 years and a rice certification that reshaped the economy of an entire island, a network of farmers who cut their chemical use in half, a market that made doing so profitable. Without all of that, the birds on Sado would not have survived. The Ministry of the Environment has set a target of more than 1,000 adult toki across the whole of Japan. There are around 500 now, all on one island. Liu Yinzing found 7. Sado proved the model works. Whether it can be replicated elsewhere, that is a question Hakui does not yet have an answer to. There are only 8 birds in the sky above Noto, and 10 more waiting their turn.